Pans start clanging before my feet hit the floor and a timer screams like something alive, so loud it cuts through sleep. A brother bangs the kitchen door like the house will fall down if breakfast is late, and I climb onto the stool with my pajamas still on because I already lost minutes. I'm stirring a pot that's hissing steam into my face while my mother stands behind me listing every mistake as if she's reading off a test I failed yesterday. "You're too slow," she snaps. "The eggs will be watery, the pancakes will be cold. What did you do with the syrup?" I say nothing. I keep my mouth shut because talking wastes time and talking draws attention. I'm 17, but I've been doing this since I was 7, so my hands move before my brain does. One brother wants eggs barely set, another wants pancakes right off the griddle, someone insists all plates be separate so nothing touches, and the baby will only take a bottle warmed to something like Goldilocks temperature. Breakfast starts at 4 a.m. and it lasts 3 hours. I time everything by sound, when the griddle clicks, when the garlic hits oil, and I know the exact noise my mother makes when she thinks something is wrong. The house breathes around me. Stomps, mutters, a radio switched too loud, feet that won't wait. My arms shake by 8 a.m. and my back feels like it's folding in middle. I shift weight from foot to foot, trying to fool the ache into leaving, but pain has a way of waiting for your attention. My skin is a map of old burns, the lines of hot pans and splashes from when I moved too fast. My fingers are stained a dull yellow from onions and constant dish soap, calluses built up like badges I never wanted. The doctor said my hands show early arthritis. "You'll need surgery eventually," he told me once, voice soft like he was sorry but not offering money or time. My parents heard him and said nothing. Who would feed 9 mouths if I took time to heal? No one ever offered to answer that question. School stopped fitting into my life years ago because dinner prep started in the afternoon and homework slid off the table like spilled flour. I'd sit in class and think about the roast in the oven at home, about the bread that needed cutting, about the baby who might wake if bottles weren't ready. Attendance became a bad number the counselors wrote down and then forgot. I learned numbers for recipes better than algebra. I could tell you the perfect boiling time for eggs, but not how to solve for ex-teachers called my mother. My mother said I was helping, and that was the end of it. There are small cruelties that sting more than the big ones. A brother grabbing food mid-stir and scorching my hand, another throwing a plate when it didn't land where he wanted, my mother squeezing a burned finger until I howled so she could show me she could hurt me if she wanted. I've had my head pushed into the sink when a pot boiled over. I kept stirring because the meal couldn't be late and we couldn't be hungry. I fainted once from dehydration, came to on the tile with my mouth full of soap, and my mother pulled me up like I was an extra chair and told me to finish the dinner. I finished it. Blood dried in the pot and no one asked. Tonight the room hums and my hands aren't steady. My back feels like a rope straining, and for the first time in a long time, my anger tastes like a plan, not just noise. I look at my mother listing off mistakes, at my brothers complaining about the heat of a pancake, at the baby wailing about a bottle, and I understand I am not just tired, I am used up. "You always act like this is nothing," I say, loud enough that the griddle stops sizzling for a second and a brother curses. My mother looks at me like I said something wrong. "Don't be dramatic," she says, and goes back to telling me what I did wrong yesterday. But tonight the words don't land like they used to. I remember being 7 on a stool when she taught me to flip pancakes with one hand and hold a crying baby with the other, as if training a machine. I remember the moment my 7th birthday shrank into a work shift with a cake nobody ate because we had to get back to feeding everyone. I think about the doctor's face, the math I never got to learn, the scholarship pamphlets I folded away in my head like contraband. I think about the tiny stash of money I've been hiding, the letters I've read in secret, the colleges I listed like distant cities on a map I promised myself I would reach. The pot hisses under my hand, and I pull it back like it burned me a second time. I decide right then I'm done letting my body be what other people use and throw away. I decide I won't be the machine anymore. I won't be the one who gets blamed when the toast is slightly dark or the fry is slightly limp. Tonight, I let the anger settle into a cold, steady decision. I'll leave. I don't have all the steps worked out, but I have enough. A hidden savings, a scholarship in my head, a weeknight when my mother goes to bingo and the windows feel unlatched. I wipe my hands on my apron, taste salt and old coffee, and tell myself aloud, I'm getting out. The words feel like a match in the dark. The acceptance letter felt like a secret sun in my hands the first time I read it, warm and impossible, so I slid it under the loose board where no brother would ever look. I'd applied to colleges in late-night bursts, fingers trembling as I filled forms I couldn't imagine sending. When the scholarship came for engineering, my heart slammed so hard I could hear it. I knew I had to plan like someone sneaking out of a war zone, not like a kid going to school. I told myself I would be gone before anyone knew the day had changed. I started stuffing coins and small bills into the hiding place only I knew, inside the hollowed corner under the third stair where the wood squeaked when you stepped wrong. My brothers never went near that step because it annoyed them to walk funny, and my mother never cleaned there. I counted pennies until my hands cramped and tucked the crumpled acceptance into a sock and the sock into a jar, and the jar slid into the cavity like it belonged there. Every night I stood in the dark and whispered the plan to the jar so it felt less insane. 2 years, I told it once. 2 years and I'm gone.
Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. All right, let's jump back into the story.
The night before I planned to leave, I couldn't sleep. My palms itched with the list of things to do. Pack, walk the 2 miles to the bus station, hitched rides, call the school to say I'd be late, anything to get out. Panic makes you think fast and stupid. I thought of sleeping pills and the way everyone passed out when they had too much wine at parties. I told myself it was just to make the house silent long enough for me to slide past. I softened my voice as I told myself it was a mercy, not a crime. I crushed pills with the back of a spoon and mixed them into the stew pot like I'd mixed sugar into coffee. I wanted to calm them, let them sleep, let the locks be weak, let the morning be mine. I was halfway into the motion of stuffing clothes into a backpack when the kitchen light flicked on hard and my mother's voice clipped the room like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, and my father stood behind her, the face I'd known all my life. My father held up the acceptance letter like a trophy or a weapon, and his smile was slow and soft when he ripped it in his hands. He shredded the paper into confetti and let it fall like snow on the counter while my stomach dropped to the floor. "You think you can just leave?" my mother said, calm as if they'd rehearsed this. "You don't even exist." She didn't shout, she explained. She told me the truth like someone lecturing a child about broken glass. "We never registered you," she said, voice flat. "We didn't file the birth papers. You were ours to raise, not to be filed away or stolen. You can't go anywhere without a birth certificate. You don't have a social, you don't have any of it." I watched the confetti of my future flutter into a sink full of water like it had been nothing. For a second, I thought she was lying to stop me, like they always did to scare me. I thought it was another punishment, another story they could tell to make me small. I grabbed my phone like a life preserver and scrolled through emails and accounts with hands that felt suddenly foreign. Every bank app said the same thing: account closed. Every document I opened showed a note that it had been reported stolen. The school records had messages marked unable to verify identity. My credit history was a blank. My emergency contacts were locked. I tapped, called, tried to breathe, and each ring only answered the same cold proof: I was erased on paper. I remembered the nurse's eyes at the ER the week before and the way she said, "We'll have to check your ID." And I had smiled because I thought I had one. I didn't. I threw my phone on the table like it was the thing that lied to me. My father folded his arms and said, "We kept you. That's what we did. We made sure you couldn't run. If you can't be turned back, you can't be taken." It was the neatest reasoning I'd ever heard for something cruel. My mother reached over and picked up a piece of the shredded letter, smoothing it like she could read it again through her fingers. "You are our job," she said, and the words landed like a hammer. The room became a small planet of panic. My backpack felt suddenly heavy with a single sock and a jar of coins. All the tiny steps I had planned, bus schedules, contacts, places to stay, collapsed because every official door I needed would require a name and a signature I had no right to make. I thought of the hollow under the stair where my life was hidden and felt like a fool for trusting wood and small coins against a house that had decided to erase me. I counted breaths until the sting of hot air in my throat faded, and I knew the fight had to change. I wasn't out yet, but now I knew the rules of the trap I'd been born into. I tucked the jar back into its secret and let my hands shake until the house quieted into its usual cruel murmur. The house closed around me like a fist after that night, and everything I could move was suddenly locked away. New locks appeared on doors I'd used my whole life, and keys vanished into my father's bedroom, where no one except him was allowed. My brothers started sitting by exits like they were guards posted at a border. One of them would accidentally block the way if I tried to slip past. My shoes were taken and put on a high shelf. I learned to tie my hair without mirrors so it wouldn't look like I was dressing to leave. They tightened the schedule into a list of chores that read like a sentence. No unsupervised minutes, no unexplained pockets of time, no opportunities. I felt the house watching me like a jury. I started working in secret because fear makes you clever in ways you didn't plan. I salvaged scraps of the shredded acceptance letter from the trash, piecing together slivers of words like someone trying to read a torn map. I hid a cheap tablet behind a stack of old cookbooks and learned to swipe it with my chin when my hands were busy. I photographed the burns and bruises on my arms and took voice memos of my mother apologizing for things she'd never apologize for in front of anyone. I scribbled dates and short notes in a notebook I found in the trash. A teacher must have thrown away the pages with the handwriting I copied into the margins, because paper with time on it felt safer than the memory in my head. Every scrap I kept was a promise to myself that I had been here and I had been hurt. At the grocery store one afternoon, I stood frozen in the cleaning aisle and read a poster with a domestic violence hotline number in big black letters. I stood with a bag of flour under my arm, and the number burned itself into my memory like a prayer I couldn't say out loud. I repeated it under my breath the way I used to repeat recipes, and the repetition made it feel less like a stranger and more like a code I could carry. I whispered it to myself walking home, hiding my head under my hood so my brothers wouldn't see me walking like I had learned to look guilty for trying to cross a sidewalk. I met a nurse once at the emergency room after a knife cut needed stitches. She was quick and efficient and kept her voice low when she worked on me. She asked routine questions and my parents lied. She saw through something in my face. At the end of the visit, she slipped 2 phone numbers into my palm like they were seeds. One number was her cell, the other was for legal aid. I swallowed the scrap of paper because my hands shook and I couldn't risk the numbers being found in my pockets. I felt the paper slide down my throat like a small secret and then sit there like a second heart. The nurse didn't ask me to swallow it. She just looked at me with a softness that didn't reach home. "You can call if things get worse," she said, and that simple permission felt like a rope thrown from a high place. Collecting proof became my work. I kept images hidden in folders on the tablet with names like recipes and notes, and voice memos under lame file names so they wouldn't draw attention. I recorded my mother saying things she'd bragged about, how she never filed my birth registration, and I saved the audio behind a password that felt fragile as glass. I took a photo of the jar under the stair and a picture of the hollowed board where I'd hidden the crumpled acceptance. At night, I rewound voice recordings and listened until my throat tired of the sound of my own voice. It felt like building a case out of crumbs, and every crumb mattered. I learned to pretend in ways that almost fooled me. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, making the motions people expected so they wouldn't look harder. I laughed when a brother made a joke, and I pretended not to notice when a plate was slammed into the sink. But inside, I was taking inventory: dates, bruises, who saw what, and what I heard. I memorized schedules and the small routines in the house so I could find a space to breathe. I practiced answers to questions in my head in case someone asked where I'd been. It was exhausting to be careful all the time, but every careful hour felt like a small deposit into a future bank I hoped to open. Sometimes I wanted to shout and tear down the walls, but I couldn't. So I worked quietly and deliberately, like someone assembling a map to a place they could barely name. I started emailing an old counselor from a hidden corner of the tablet, sending pieces of the proof I gathered and waiting for answers like mail from a distant city. The counselor wrote back with careful words and plans that felt like scaffolding. It was slow, it was fragile, and it was the most solid thing I had. I kept hiding, kept saving, kept swallowing the tiny papers and numbers, and kept telling myself the plan would not fail. Each day I sewed another stitch in the escape I was building from the inside out. I ran barefoot before dawn because the road was the only place that felt big enough to hold my panic, and the cold cracked my soles like paper. I jogged 2 miles with my backpack banging my spine, past houses still breathing in sleep, and I knocked on the door of a teacher who'd worried about me for years. Teacher. She opened the door with her robe on and gasped when she saw my arms and the bruises spreading under my sleeves. "Oh my God," she said, and she ushered me inside like I was suddenly the most important thing on her schedule. I told her I couldn't stay, and she said quietly, "Sit, let me look." She photographed the scars and stitched the pictures into files on her phone, her hands steady even when mine shook. The teacher, wrote my name down and filled out witness statements like she was building scaffolding for something that could hold me up. She asked questions I'd learned to avoid, but answered anyway. Dates, what happened, who saw it, and her pen moved across paper like she believed me. "We'll call someone," she said, and then she called a legal aid lawyer named Cadden, the lawyer, who picked up like someone waiting to take a call he knew mattered. Cadden's voice was careful and direct, and he told the teacher what he needed. Photos, notes, anything that could show I existed outside the house's story. He said things about affidavits and petitions, and delayed birth certificates in a way that sounded like a ladder I could climb. They began the first fragile steps right there in the kitchen of her small house. The teacher photographed everything with angles I couldn't manage myself. She mailed copies, printed my bruises like stamps, and typed out the statements I'd given. Cadden called back and his voice was steady. "We'll open a file," he said. "Bring what you can, and we'll keep anything confidential." The word confidential felt like a shield, a thing I could hide behind. I left with a folder in my bag and a map of what to do next. More photos, any doctor notes, dates, and names. I promised the teacher I would be careful, and she put a scarf around my shoulders like a small, human thing to hold me. I sneaked back into the house before anyone even knew I'd left because I could not risk being gone during the day. I slipped in like a shadow and thought I'd fooled them, but they punished me anyway with new control measures that felt as if the walls had grown extra teeth. My father put car keys into a gun safe and told my brothers the code was for him alone, like the world outside was a lock to be denied me. My shoes were taken and locked away in the attic so I couldn't run, and one brother was assigned to sleep outside my door every night until further notice. He sat on the floor like a person waiting for someone to fall asleep, and the sound of him breathing kept me awake with dread. My mother announced a fresh set of rules in a voice that made every word sound like law. "Daily checklist," she said, handing me a paper with tasks and times. "You'll be up at 3 a.m. to start chores. Hourly check-ins, if you're not where you should be, you answer. No unsupervised time." The list went on. Scrub this, polish that, inventory of pots, bed made by noon. She read it slowly, and when she finished, she folded the paper and put it in my hand like a promise and a threat sewn together. A brother laughed and said, "Sounds like a boot camp," and they all laughed, but the laugh landed on me like a bench. At night, when the house finally quieted and the moon leaned against the windows, I recorded my mother on my hidden tablet. I had learned to place it where the light wouldn't catch it and to let my finger tremble while I hit record. She sat across from me complaining about taxes and stories she'd tell like victories, and in between she said what I'd suspected for years. "We never filed her birth papers," she said out loud, and she smiled as if confessing a neat secret. I kept the voice memo safe and backed it up in 3 different places on the tablet, labeling it under a stupid file name so it wouldn't draw attention. Hearing her voice say, it made the truth less like a rumor and more like a legal nail I could use. The new rules felt like a cage with extra bars. I learned schedules by heart and memorized when brothers left the house, where keys were kept, and when the windows were least watched. I started to move like someone counting seconds instead of lives, slipping into spaces adults didn't notice and keeping the folder from the teacher always under my mattress. The teacher and Cadden had started something, but the house pushed back like a storm. I had to be smarter, quieter, and more careful than before. I was collecting proof, finding allies, and learning the law's language one slow step at a time. The plan was fragile, but it was real enough to keep me going. The phone felt like a hot coal in my hand the first time I dialed the number I'd memorized from the grocery store, and a woman answered with a voice that was careful and steady. The hotline worker, asked short questions and listened longer. When I whispered about locks and keys and a shredded letter, she didn't gasp or preach. She taught me a phrase to use if I ever needed to be taken out fast. Say, "I need the red umbrella," she said. That tells us this is an emergency and to start extraction. She walked me through what would happen next, who would get the message, and how they would try to keep me safe. She also put me in touch with a shelter contact, and a lawyer who could file papers for me. Before I hung up, I repeated the phrase until it felt like a password in my mouth. I practiced it alone in my room with the tablet hidden under a sheet, saying the words until they came out steady. "I need the red umbrella," I said once, twice, over and over, until the phrase sounded less like a joke and more like a tool I could use. The shelter contact's voice left me a number and the lawyer's email, and I saved both in my head and in a folder labeled Notes on the tablet. Each time I said the phrase, I imagined the house unlocking, keys appearing, and the air in my lungs getting easier to pull. It felt ridiculous to rehearse, but I knew rehearsal might be the only thing between me and running for my life one day. The day I actually needed the plan came sooner than I wanted. One evening, a brother grabbed me in the kitchen over something small, a missing spoon or a wrong plate, and suddenly his anger became a battering weight. He slammed my head into the counter so hard the tile bit the skin above my eye and the world spun slow and loud. I felt the blood warm and sticky, and the room turned into a roar of voices telling me what I'd done wrong. I clutched the sink and tried not to black out. When he finally let go, I could taste copper, and I knew hiding the wound would be harder than lying. I walked like I had a fever to my room and texted the hotline number with the phrase I'd practiced until my fingers stopped shaking. "I need the red umbrella," I typed, and then I hit send before my courage could fold. Within an hour, the plan moved. Cars pulled up outside, and I heard a knock that was not a brother's voice. Officers introduced themselves and moved with the quiet of people who had rehearsed this entry. Officer Leo Gonzalez, police officer, came in with a badge and a comm I hadn't expected. He asked me if I was safe, and when I nodded he kept looking at the bruise on my head like he wanted to catalog every pain. "We're here to help," he said, and he didn't say it like a line from a TV show. He knelt and documented my injuries, took pictures with his phone like the teacher had, and asked me in a low voice what had happened. I told him everything I could remember, and then I handed him the voice memo of my mother saying she'd never filed my birth certificate. Leo listened and then said, "We're going to get you medical care and get this documented." He called for paramedics who checked my wounds and said I needed stitches, cleaned me up, and wrapped my head with bandages that smelled like antiseptic and safety. The paramedics asked where I wanted to go, and I barely knew what to say until the shelter contact from the hotline called to confirm I could be placed. A social worker arrived with forms and a gentle way of answering questions I hadn't planned to say out loud. She explained what shelter life would be like, how long they could keep me safe, and what rights I had even without a birth certificate. For once, someone was making choices with me instead of for me. They packed a small bag for me and someone handed me a warm drink like a tiny island of care. As they drove away, I realized the house would not be screaming for eggs at 3 a.m., and no one would expect me to be up to scrub pots. The silence in the ambulance and later on in the shelter felt strange and almost foreign, but it also felt like the first honest thing I'd had in years. I slept on a cot, without being woken for chores, and woke without the sound of timers and yelling. For the first time in a long time, I closed my eyes and didn't count steps for an escape plan. I had used the words I practiced, and people had come. It was terrifying and it was relief, and the two things fit together like puzzle pieces I'd been missing my whole life. At the shelter, I felt like I'd stepped into a room full of people finally paying attention to the life I'd been invisible in, and it was both comforting and strange. Legal advocates sat me down, and the school counselor, who'd helped before, pulled out folders with her neat handwriting. A hospital nurse, came with a clipboard and small eyes that looked like they'd seen this before. Together, they began to collect everything anyone had kept. ER reports from that night and others, vaccination logs from when I'd been taken in as a child, pieces of attendance sheets showing months and years I'd been absent, and teacher notes that mentioned bruises or how quiet I'd been. The pile looked like proof that I wasn't a rumor. The legal team started calling places and asking for records while the counselor organized what we already had. The nurse showed them her notes from stitches and the burns she'd treated, and she added her own short report about signs of malnutrition and repetitive stress injuries. Seeing my arm photos and hearing the nurse say, "arthritis developing," on paper felt like a stranger translating my body into something official. I watched the legal advocate tape copies together and write dates in thick black ink. "This shows you were here," she said simply. "It shows you didn't just disappear." Her voice had no pity, just work to do, and that steadiness was a kind of kindness. The clinic that had treated me for years was slow to hand over records at first. Clinic staff worried about privacy or legal exposure, or maybe they just needed someone to push them. Cadden, my lawyer, wrote a formal request and promised confidentiality and purpose. After legal pressure, they released years of notes, repeated visits for burns, for stomach pains, for infections from dirty cuts. The records listed repetitive stress syndrome and early onset arthritis, and showed visits dating back to my early teens. Those entries were like a chain someone could follow to show I had been living and suffering in this town for years. When the clinic finally sent everything, I sat on the edge of the cot and read line after line until my throat tightened. We started building a packet with everything the advocates could get their hands on. Affidavits from the teacher who'd taken my photos, sworn statements from neighbors who'd noticed me leaving early for work, notes from the counselor about Miss School, the nurse's clinic records, and the ER photos Officer Leo had taken all fit together like evidence in a case. Cadden explained how the law looked at continuous presence. Medical records, school records, and witness statements could create the paper trail that proved I existed and had always been here. "We have to show you were born here and lived here," he said, and his fingers moved through the stack of papers like a conductor signaling an orchestra. Cadden filed a petition for a delayed birth certificate, which felt like asking the court to say what should have been said for years. We used affidavits to show where I had lived, who had seen me, and how the medical records matched my story of repeated injuries and chronic conditions. We also applied for municipal ID first because the delayed petition would take time. With the ID, I could start opening a bank account and getting medical care more easily. The municipal office took the affidavits and copies of the school and clinic documents and issued a temporary ID. And I wept a little when I saw my face on a card that said my name and had an expiration date I could aim for instead of a blank future. We asked the court for a protective order against my family because they had circled the shelter in cars, sent threatening messages, and tried to find me. The judge granted a temporary order almost the same day, and I remember the relief like a physical weight lifting off my chest. The protective order meant there were legal consequences if my family came near me or contacted me, and it put police on notice. Later, after we gathered more evidence of harassment, text screenshots, photos of cars parked outside the shelter, and recorded threats, the judge extended the order to last longer. Each extension felt like buying time and safety. The legal process moved slowly in places, like a river cutting stone, but every paper filed and every witness statement felt like a step toward making my life official. My municipal ID let me open a bank account with a counselor's help and apply for a social security number once the delayed birth certificate process was underway. I started small classes the shelter helped me enroll in, learning computer basics and financial planning. Advocates helped me write emails to the university asking them to hold my scholarship, and the admissions office agreed to defer my spot for a year. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was permission to keep trying. Holding the packet of documents the legal team had made felt strange and warm. It proved I had been here, that my injuries weren't accidents, and that my life mattered enough to fight for. For the first time, I could see a paper trail leading out of the house and into something that looked like a future, and that sight kept me moving forward through long waits and hearings. I tried work the way people say you should: get a job, pay bills, sleep in your own place. But the first shift at a diner blew up everything I thought I could handle. The sizzle of oil felt like a shout, and the clanging was a memory with teeth. I stood at the grill for minutes, and my hands remembered burns and the smell of grease, and it all folded me up from the inside. I called out that I couldn't do it, left my apron on the counter, and walked out barefoot into the night because the heels of my shoes still felt unsafe. The manager shouted my name, but I kept going. I cried in the parking lot and told myself it was okay to stop, that I wasn't failing. My body was protecting me. It took time to find a job that didn't force me back into the kitchen I'd fled. The shelter helped me look, and I tried a few things until I found a quieter place, the local thrift store. The work there was slow and steady instead of loud and sudden. I sorted donations by hand, folded shirts, labeled boxes, and learned to like the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. A woman who managed the back room showed me how to stack plates safely and how to mark items for the floor. The work didn't demand my whole body like the kitchen did. I could breathe between tasks, and my hands learned new motions that didn't flare into panic. The thrift store didn't pay much, but it gave me space to build a routine that didn't feel like survival on fast forward. While I built small, safe parts of a life, Cadden, my legal aid attorney, kept pushing the larger battles forward. He filed motions and answered the clinic's excuses, and he made the health center hand over years of medical records after a weeks-long fight. Those files were hard to get because of protective policies and red tape, but Cadden's persistence made the clinic produce detailed notes about repetitive stress injuries, burns, visits for malnutrition symptoms, and early arthritis. Reading those records was strange. They were my pain turned into neat language and dates that the court could follow. The clinic's eventual release of the files helped the petition look like a story with a paper trail instead of a rumor. We filed the petition for a delayed birth certificate and then waited through the public notice period, which felt like watching the sky for rain that might never come. The court required a notice in the paper to give anyone a chance to object, and the legal team made sure the publication went out properly. Each day of waiting pulled at something raw in me because waiting felt too close to being left again. But the notice ran, and the waiting period ended without anyone challenging it. The judge signed the order granting my birth certificate, and I remember the way my hands shook when the paper finally had a seal on it. That birth certificate was a small square of paper that changed everything. With it, I went to get a temporary state ID, and the clerk took my prints and stamped a card with my face. For the first time, I had a state document that matched the name I had been using in my head for years. I applied for Social Security next, an exercise in boxes and questions and proof that my life existed on official terms. I sat at a desk with a stranger reading off my name like it belonged in the world, and not only in the house that hidden me. The Social Security card came with a number I could use for jobs, for medical care, for taxes, for a bank. The bank opened an account for me with the help of a counselor from the shelter who'd coached me through signatures and options. Getting the permanent state ID felt like putting down a heavy stone that I'd been dragging behind me. The temporary card was useful but limited. The permanent ID was the thing that let me apply for real jobs without awkward explanations, rent a place, or enroll in classes without 100 plugs in the conversation. Each step was a small chain reaction: paper to proof, proof to access, access to choices. My name on documents made offices stop treating me like a ghost. I could sign my own forms. I could set up direct deposit. I could do things that people who had recognized me as property had never let me practice. Cadden kept filing, and we kept responding to small pushes from my family, threats logged, cars photographed outside the shelter, messages saved. The protective order got extended when judges saw the pattern of harassment laid out in our filings. That extra time gave me the window I needed to move into a small shared apartment the shelter helped me apply for. The apartment was bare, and sometimes the quiet of it felt too loud, but hearing my kettle boil without someone demanding toast at 3 a.m. felt like freedom you could build around. I bought a cheap mattress and a second-hand table, and taught myself to make a single bowl of pasta without thinking of it as war. I enrolled in community college classes the legal team and counselors helped me schedule. The scholarship I'd fought for was held for a year while I proved I could get my documents in order. The university agreed to defer my admission, and that was a lifeline I clung to when doubts crept in. I took a basic math class and a computer skills course, and each small success, turning in an assignment, getting a passing grade, felt like sanding down a rough edge inside me. The arthritis still nagged my hands, and sometimes pain decided the agenda for my day, but having choices about when to rest and when to work felt like power. Transitioning into independence wasn't a straight line. There were bad nights and phone calls that made me jump, and there were forms I didn't understand that Cadden or the shelter had to walk me through. But every document they helped me secure turned an erasure into proof. Paper became a map out of the house. It didn't make my past vanish, but it made a new future possible, one I could name, claim, and walk into step by small, deliberate step. Hearings blurred into each other like a bad dream that kept waking me up, and the months felt fast and slow at the same time, as if someone had hit fast forward and paused together. I sat in rooms with lawyers and judges who said things with serious faces while I clutched files and tried not to think about the kitchen timers. Protective orders were written, served, and enforced. They made my family keep distance on paper even when my heart wanted them close for reasons I couldn't explain. I went to shelter meetings and legal appointments, and I started therapy for complex trauma sessions where I learned words for feelings I hadn't had names for before and practiced breathing through panic attacks that began at the sound of a clatter. Court meant showing all the proof I had collected, and I learned the odd comfort of being believed by strangers with stamps. I handed over bloodied photos, doctor's notes, voice memos, and affidavits from the teacher and the nurse who'd helped me. Cadden, my attorney, walked me through each step and explained how a file could change the way the law saw me. "This isn't just stories," he said. "It's paper and dates and signatures. It's you on record." Hearing it out loud made my throat fill with something sharp, like relief braided with grief. The judge signed the delayed birth certificate order after the hearing that made me feel both small and enormous in the same hour. When the paper came with the court seal pressed into it, I ran my thumb over the raised edge like it was proof the world had finally taken me seriously. With that birth certificate, I applied for a passport, and then for a state ID and a social security number. Each office I walked into looked at me differently once I could show them documents with my name matching across pages. I felt my identity stitched together in public places. The bank where I opened an account with my first real paycheck, the DMV where I took a number and sat in a chair with other people waiting like me, and the Social Security office where I listened to someone say the number that would let me work without lies. Moving out into a tiny shared apartment felt like stepping off an island. The woman I moved in with, roommate, had left a bad situation too, and when she first knocked on my door carrying a bag of groceries, she said, "We keep the door bolted and we check the locks. No one sleeps outside your room here." That simple promise was the first safety I could feel in my bones. We learned each other's sounds and habits, shared a microwave, and compared scars like secret maps. I bolted the door at night, and learned to sleep without someone posted on the other side. I found myself waking without expecting to be yelled at for a slightly overcooked egg, and it felt like being allowed to exist without explanation. Work was small and steady at the thrift store, and my paychecks started to look like a life I could plan. I learned to deposit money into my bank account with a few cents that felt like a down payment on freedom. I bought a cheap pot and a small pan on purpose and cooked pasta for myself one afternoon, stirring in garlic and oil and something green-eyed saved from the farmer's market. I sat at the tiny table and ate without thinking of who would complain about the salt level. I didn't have to stand for hours to feed a dozen people. I was making food because I wanted to, and it felt like a small ritual of ownership. School at night fit into my life like a soft shoe. Community college classes in the evening let me keep work and therapy and paperwork tangled together in a way that didn't break me. I enrolled in basic math and physics, simple building blocks toward the engineering program I'd won a scholarship for years before. The university agreed to hold my scholarship if I could provide the required documents within a year, and that agreement felt like a ladder I could climb. I met with an admissions counselor, who helped me fill out the remaining forms and who said, "We'll keep your spot. Finish these steps and come to campus when you can." Her voice was steady and practical, and it gave me permission to plan. There were harder things, too. My family still sent threats by phone and cars lingered in my old neighborhood, and I kept calling the shelter when a noise outside made my hands go cold. Court dates came and went, and sometimes the protective orders felt like thin paper between me and danger, but each extension bought me more time. Therapy taught me to name triggers and to use tools when panic came. Breathing, grounding, and saying aloud what I could control. I learned to patch my hands when arthritis flared, and to ask for help at work without feeling ashamed. The papers I gathered, the birth certificate with its raised seal, the state ID, the social security receipt, turned erasure into presence. They let agencies see me and let me make choices without hiding. I still carry old aches and the memory of a stove's heat that taught me to be small, but the life ahead is mine to shape. I have a bed I pay for, classes I attend by choice, and a pot I bought to make pasta on purpose. When I look back at the kitchen that scarred me, I don't see only pain. I see the place that taught me how to keep going. Now, with documents in my hand and a tiny apartment door bolted behind me, I'm finally walking toward a future I chose. The papers proved I existed. The life ahead belongs to me.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.